The true origin of the dollar's global power. What historians get wrong. Take a dollar bill out of your pocket and look at it. It is a piece of paper. It is not backed by gold. It is not backed by silver. It is backed by nothing you can hold in your hand. And yet this piece of paper is the most powerful object in the global economy. It is the currency in which oil is priced, in which nations hold their savings, in which most of the world's trade is settled. More than half of all the money held in reserve by the governments of the earth is held in this one country's paper. The story you have probably been told about how this happened is a story of American strength. America grew into the biggest economy, so its money became the biggest money. Simple, natural, inevitable. But that story is wrong, and here is the detail that proves it. There was a time, and not so long ago, when the dollar was a provincial afterthought, a currency that barely crossed the ocean. Of the money that ruled the world, the money in which global trade was conducted and empires kept their wealth, was the British pound sterling. As late as the eve of the First World War, the United States was already the largest economy on Earth, and had been for decades. And yet its currency was almost nowhere in international finance. Read that again. America became the world's biggest economy around 1870, but the dollar did not become the world's dominant currency until well into the 20th century. For roughly half a century, the largest economy on the planet did not have the leading currency. Economic size by itself was not enough. So if raw economic power does not automatically make a global currency, what does? What actually happened to dethrone the mighty pound and crown the dollar in its place? The answer is not a story of natural growth. It is a story of two catastrophic world wars, a deliberate act of financial engineering, and a broken promise about gold that should have destroyed the dollar and instead made it invincible. And this is the true story of how a piece of paper conquered the world. To understand it, we have to begin in the age of gold and the reign of the pound. For most of the 19th century, the world's money was anchored to a single ancient idea. That real value was gold. Under the classical gold standard, a nation's paper currency was simply a claim on a fixed quantity of gold sitting in a vault. A pound note could be exchanged for a set weight of gold. So could the currencies of other major nations. Money was in effect just a convenient paper stand-in for the metal. And at the center of this golden web sat London. Britain was the first great industrial power, the master of the seas, and the ruler of the largest empire in history. The city of London was the financial capital of the world. Global trade in everything from cotton to tea to steel was financed through London banks and settled in British pounds. To trade with the world was, in practice, to deal in sterling. The pound was not just Britain's money, it was the world's money, backed by gold and by the seemingly unshakable power of the British Empire. Picture the world of money in that age. In the great banking houses of the city of London, clerks and high collars bent over leather ledgers, recording debts and credits that spanned every continent. In the vaults beneath, bars of gold sat stacked in the gloom, the silent foundation of the whole system. Out in the harbors, ships carried not just cargo, but bills of exchange. Paper promises written in pounds that could be trusted anywhere on Earth because London stood behind them. This was a world in which British paper was as good as gold, quite literally, and everyone knew it. An American merchant in 1900 selling goods abroad would very likely be paid in pounds, not dollars. The dollar was respectable, stable, useful at home. But on the world stage, it was a minor player, dwarfed by the currency of the empire on which the sun never set. Yes, the idea that the American greenback might one day replace the pound would have struck a London banker of that era as almost absurd, like suggesting a provincial dialect might replace the king's English across the world. The system looked eternal. It was not. And what shattered it was not economics, but war. In the summer of 1914, the First World War broke out, and it did something no one had thought possible. It broke the gold standard, and it began to break Britain. Modern industrial war is unimaginably expensive. To pay for the slaughter, the warring nations of Europe spent everything they had and then far more than they had. They suspended the gold standard because no nation fighting for its life could allow its citizens to drain the treasury of gold. They borrowed colossal sums. And crucially, they bought enormous quantities of weapons, food, and raw materials from the one great industrial power that was not yet in the fighting and was safely across an ocean, the United States. I watch what this did to the flow of gold and money in the world because this is the hinge on which everything turns. Europe bought American guns, American steel, American wheat, and American oil, and it paid for them in gold and in debt. Ship after ship of gold crossed the Atlantic from Europe to America. Britain and France, once the great creditors of the world, the nations to whom everyone else owed money, were transformed into debtors, and the country they now owed was the United States. Imagine those crossings. Deep in the holds of steamships plowing westward across the Atlantic, crates of gold bars rode in the dark, insured for fortunes, guarded like the lifeblood of nations, which is exactly what they were. Each shipment was another piece of Europe's accumulated wealth, built up over centuries, changing hands to pay for a war that was destroying the old order that had produced it. Europe was, quite literally, shipping its treasure to America and receiving shells and wheat in return. By the end of the First World War in 1918, the financial center of gravity of the world had shifted. The United States had become the world's greatest creditor and had accumulated a staggering share of the world's gold. Britain had won the war, but it had spent its treasure and mortgaged its future to do so. The nation that had been the world's banker for a century was now quietly a borrower. And the new banker to the world sat in New York. And yet, remarkably, the pound did not fall yet. This is the part that reveals something deep about how global money really works. Even after 1918, with America holding the gold and the wealth, the pound remained the world's leading currency. Britain fought ferociously to restore its old financial glory, even forcing the pound back onto the gold standard at its pre-war value in 1925. A decision that crippled its own economy in a doomed attempt to preserve London's prestige. Why did the pound survive its own decline for so long? Because a global currency is not held up by economics alone. It is held up by habit, by trust, by the vast web of institutions, contracts, and relationships built up over generations. The whole world knew how to use sterling. Its banks, its lawyers, its trading houses all ran on the pound. This inertia, this deep grooving of global habit, kept the pound on its throne for years after the economic ground beneath it had crumbled. The 1925 decision to force the pound back to its old gold value captures the tragedy perfectly. British leaders did it to restore national pride and London's standing, to make the pound once again a symbol of unshakable strength. But at the pre-war rate, the pound was now overvalued, which made British exports too expensive and choked British industry. The country strangled its own economy, threw men out of work, and endured years of hardship and strikes, all to defend the prestige of a currency whose golden age was already over. It was the act of a champion refusing to admit the fight was lost. A reserve currency, once established, commands such loyalty that nations will wound themselves to preserve it. That lesson will matter enormously at the end of this story. But habit can only defy reality for so long. And then came the second blow, the one that finished the pound for good. The 1930s brought the Great Depression, which shattered the global economy, and finally drove Britain off the gold standard for good in 1931. And then, in 1939, came the Second World War. And it did to Britain what the First War had begun, only far more completely. Once again, Britain spent everything to survive. Once again, it bought what it needed from the United States. But this time, there was no ambiguity about the outcome. Britain ended the Second World War victorious and utterly bankrupt. Stripped of its foreign investments, buried under debt, its empire beginning to dissolve. The United States, by contrast, ended the war with its homeland untouched, its industry supercharged, and its vaults holding the majority of all the monetary gold on Earth. By some estimates, around 2/3 of the world's gold reserves sat in American hands. The old world of British financial supremacy was gone. And into that vacuum, the United States moved not by accident, but by design. Because unlike after the First World War, this time the Americans had a plan. In July 1944, while the war was still raging, delegates from 44 nations gathered at a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the financial order of the post-war world. And the system they built, largely on American terms, placed the dollar at the very center of the global economy. Here is how it worked. And it was a masterstroke. The United States promised that its dollar would be convertible into gold at a fixed rate, $35 for 1 ounce. The dollar was, in effect, as good as gold. And then every other nation in the system pegged its own currency not to gold directly, but to the dollar. Do you see the elegance of it? Gold sat at the foundation, but the dollar sat on top of the gold, and every other currency sat on top of the dollar. The dollar became the indispensable middle layer of the entire global financial system, the sun around which every other currency orbited. Nations would now hold their reserves not in gold alone, but in dollars, because dollars earned interest and were as good as gold anyway. The dollar had been deliberately engineered into the keystone of the world economy. For a generation, this system worked, and it worked brilliantly. The post-war decades brought an explosion of global trade and prosperity, all lubricated by a stable dollar that everyone trusted and everyone held. The dollar was now unquestionably the king of currencies. But there was a flaw at the very heart of the design, a hidden contradiction that would eventually blow the whole system apart. And the way the United States handled that explosion is the most important and least understood part of this entire story. The flaw was this: the world needed dollars, more and more of them, to fuel its growing trade. Only the United States could supply those dollars, and it did so by spending abroad and running deficits, sending dollars out into the world. But every one of those dollars was by solemn promise a claim on American gold. As the years passed, the number of dollars held outside the United States grew and grew until it vastly exceeded the amount of gold sitting in American vaults. The promise, $35 for an ounce of gold, was becoming one that America could not possibly keep. There were far too many dollars and nowhere near enough gold. By the late 1960s, the world began to notice. Nations led by France began to suspect that the dollar was overvalued and the promise was hollow. And they started doing something alarming. They started turning in their dollars and demanding American gold in return. Ship by ship, the gold that had flooded into America began to flow back out. A slow-motion run on the bank had begun, and the bank was the United States Treasury. And the system was headed for collapse. America faced a choice. It could drastically cut its spending and defend the gold promise, or it could do something radical. And on the 15th of August, 1971, President Richard Nixon did the radical thing. In a television address, he announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars into gold. He called it temporary. It was permanent. In that moment, he severed the dollar from gold entirely. Think about what had just happened. The central promise underpinning the dollar, the thing that made it as good as gold, had been broken. The dollar was now backed by nothing but the word of the United States government. By every rule of financial logic, this should have been a catastrophe for the dollar. A currency that breaks its fundamental promise should collapse. Confidence should evaporate. The world should have fled to something else. And here's the astonishing twist, the very core of what most people get wrong about the dollar. It did not collapse. It did the opposite. Freed from the constraint of gold, the dollar did not fall from its throne. It became more powerful than ever. How is that possible? How does a currency break its central promise and emerge stronger? The answer reveals the deepest truth about global money. By 1971, the dollar was no longer just a currency. It had become an entire ecosystem, a habit so deeply embedded in the machinery of the world that there was simply no practical alternative. The whole planet already priced its goods in dollars, held its savings in dollars, wrote its contracts in dollars, and ran its banks on dollars. Just as the pound had survived on inertia decades after Britain's decline, the dollar now had an even deeper, wider, more entrenched grip on the world. There was nowhere else for the world's money to go. And then the dollar found a new anchor, one arguably more powerful than gold. In the years after 1971, an arrangement took hold in which the world's oil, the single most essential commodity on Earth, continued to be priced and sold overwhelmingly in dollars. Every nation that needed oil, which was every nation, needed dollars to buy it. This created a vast, permanent, structural demand for the dollar that had nothing to do with gold at all. Gold had been replaced by something the modern world needed even more desperately: energy. So the dollar had pulled off the impossible. It had cut its link to gold and lost nothing, because its true backing was no longer a metal in a vault. Its true backing was the entire architecture of global trade, the depth of American financial markets, the might of the American economy, and the simple, overwhelming fact that the whole world was already built to run on dollars. The dollar was backed by the world's dependence on the dollar. It had become self-reinforcing. So step back and look at the true shape of how the dollar conquered the world, because it is nothing like the simple story of American economic size. Economic size alone did nothing for 50 years, while the dollar languished behind the pound. And what actually transferred power was war. Two colossal wars that bankrupted Britain and Europe and shipped their gold and their wealth across the Atlantic to the United States. What locked in that power was design, the deliberate engineering at Bretton Woods that placed the dollar at the center of the post-war system. And what made that power permanent was, paradoxically, the breaking of the gold promise in 1971, which freed the dollar from any real constraint. while its global dominance had already become too entrenched to challenge. And this reveals the pattern that most accounts of money completely miss. A global currency is not fundamentally about economics. It is about power, trust, and above all, entrenchment. The pound ruled long after Britain's economy had been eclipsed, held up by habit and institution. The dollar rules today, even though it is backed by nothing tangible, held up by the sheer inertia of a world that has no ready alternative and cannot easily build one. A dominant currency is like a language, and the reason everyone uses it is that everyone else already uses it, and that self-reinforcing logic is extraordinarily hard to break. Which brings us finally to today, and to the question hanging over the dollar's throne. Because the dollar's dominance, though still immense, is no longer absolute. Its share of the world's reserves has been slowly, quietly slipping for 2 decades, from over 70% at the start of this century to under 60% now. Nations wary of American power are seeking ways to trade around the dollar. Central banks are quietly buying gold again, the very metal the dollar once dethroned. But remember the deepest lesson of this entire story. The pound did not fall the moment Britain's economy was overtaken. It clung to its throne for half a century, propped up by habit and inertia, until 2 world wars finally tore it down. Reserve currencies do not die quickly or easily. They are dislodged only by enormous forces, and usually only when a clear successor is ready to take the crown. Today, no such successor is obviously ready, so the dollar reigns still. A piece of paper backed by nothing but the world's inability to imagine anything else. It did not win because America was big. It won because Britain bled, because Bretton Woods was cleverly built, and because by the time the promise of gold was broken, the world was already too dependent on the dollar to let it go. The next time you hold that piece of paper, remember what it really is. Not a claim on gold, not a product of American wealth alone. It is the accumulated inheritance of 2 world wars, one brilliant act of financial design, and a broken promise that somehow made a currency stronger. It is power disguised as paper, and it rules the world for the oldest reason there is, because everyone believes it does.